Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the first podcast of EkaShri's knowledge series that we are piloting today. We are extremely excited to get started, and we'll tell you a little bit more about what we're trying to do with this podcast initiative, and we hope that you will like it. So to introduce ourselves, my name is Vedant. I am a certified yoga teacher, finished my yoga teacher's training 10 years ago, and since then have taught classes at a local public Sunnyvale Hindu temple for the years during high school. Then from there, went off to college where yoga for me was a little bit more of an internal practice, got a sense to understand personally what are the benefits of yoga from both the meditation and a physical perspective. And since then, once the pandemic hit, have been able to resume my teaching with teaching yoga through these weekly Zoom classes, which I've enjoyed doing. By way of professional work, I'm in the finance industry and am working in the healthcare investing industry as of date. So I'll turn it over to Shriram ji, who we also have on the podcast today. So please feel free to introduce yourself, Shriram ji.
Namaste. Thank you, Vedanji, and welcome everyone for the first podcast. Let me briefly introduce myself. I've been doing yoga and enjoying yoga as a practitioner as well as sharing yoga in the role of a teacher for about 30 years now. And I have derived great joy both in my personal practice as well as sharing yoga with others. One of the things that I have discovered is that by studying the wisdom of yoga, it profoundly elevates the quality of my yoga practice, as well as it helps us give pointers or tips to lead a life of harmony, including points such as how to deal with negative emotions or how to face challenges in life. And there is so much wisdom that is contained in yoga that I derive the same joy through my yoga practice that I do inside the yoga mat. Same joy I derive when I study the wisdom of yoga as well.
Thank you, Shriramji. And that is, I think, the exact impetus for why we're even doing this podcast in the first place, right? Because there's so much knowledge out there, so much to be passed down, like you said. And I think there's always going to be nuggets of information that I think everyone is going to be able to benefit from, regardless of what kind of backgrounds, context, circumstances you come from. And so I think on that point, just to give our audience a little bit of a brief background on the podcast and what we're trying to do here. So what we learned, when we started, when I started resuming teaching yoga classes a little bit a couple months ago and earlier this year, we decided to add a section at the end of each of these classes where we would take these different topics such as Ashtanga Yoga, which we'll talk about today, and other types of different topics that are contained within the yoga philosophy, and sort of decompose them into different sort of manageable entities, which we can kind of have a conversation around and understand what is the real application of those topics to our daily lives. And I think we met with a lot of positive feedback and reception from those particular topics after those yoga classes, and the discussion around them was incredible and was a very high-powered discussion as well. So as a natural extension of that, we thought we'd try to pilot this podcast initiative where we would take these different topics, try to dissect them a little bit more, and just understand and have a further conversation around what exactly do these various different concepts and topics mean, and how can we kind of apply these concepts to our daily lives. So what we're trying to do with this podcast here is we're going to have different 30 to 45-minute episodes where we'll discuss different types of these topics within yoga philosophy on a regular interval. And the goal of this podcast isn't to just give another source of textbook lectures on specific topics, but rather to explore the topic in an accessible way and focus on what are the real world applications of these topics as applied to modern life. And the format we're going to have here for these different podcast discussions is it's going to be a Q&A format with several, pre-prepared questions or discussion topics on the topic that Shriramji and myself will be engaging in. And we'll then plan to upload these podcasts and the content to the EkaShri website to start building a repository of of different discussion topics and build up a sort of holistic knowledge base that anyone who's interested in hearing more on specific topics can basically dive into and get a chance to listen to in these different bite-sized manageable formats. So at some point, we may potentially explore the path of having a live audience when we record. So definitely let us know if you're interested in attending these sessions live. And if you have any subjects or topics that you would like to suggest, feel free to email us at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know. So with that, that's the podcast structure and how we plan to, talk about these different topics on the podcast. So before we dive into our topic today, which is Ashtanga Yoga, Shriramji, if there's anything you would like to mention up front, would invite you to, bring that up right now, and then we can get started on our discussion for today.
Thank you so much, Vedantji, for the introduction. As you mentioned, the objective here is to share our thoughts on different subjects in yoga. So it's not just a conceptual or a textbook type of understanding. So we are going to share our personal experiences with those topics and how we can practicalize the wisdom that is contained in yoga, and how perhaps we can live the teachings of yoga to benefit our day-to-day life.
Wonderful. And so with that, why don't we get started on our first topic for today and the next couple of sessions, which will be kind of dealing with and delving deep into Ashtanga Yoga. But even before that, Shriramji, I think I'm curious to hear what your perspective is. But, for me personally, when I tell, friends my age, more the teenage adolescent population, right, growing up, when people think about yoga, and even this is probably true in the Western culture in America today, when people think about yoga, right, they think about purely the physical sort of asana, the physical posture component of yoga, where they just think it's sort of a set of practices that they can do to get more fit. They can use it as a way to complement some kind of athletic activity. And so the real focus, and I think, of different things, like, for example, commercial yoga franchises that you see in malls and stuff like that, they have this emphasis on, for example, all the physical postures and doing it in a very heated environment, for example. So the focus has seemed to be entirely physical when it comes to yoga practice. And I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of just how yoga has been sort of transferred and assessed by the Western society here. So, what do we think when I think of yoga, though, after going through the yoga practice and yoga teacher training that I went through a couple of years ago, it's so much more than just the physical practice. And so you have the meditative component, it's really just the whole lifestyle, right? About how you think about making series of decisions, how you think about living your life, both on and off the mat. So Shriramji, to you, what does yoga actually mean?
So you're right, Vedantji. Most people's introduction to yoga is through the way of asanas or physical postures. For example, when we open a book on yoga, most likely we see pictures of people doing postures and how to keep the body fit. And in fact, the practice of asanas is indeed very powerful. It is one of the practices that attends to all parts of the body, all the major joints, all the major muscles of the body, all the systems of the body, not just a musculoskeletal system, but across all the systems. So the practice of asanas is very rich and holistic. But having said that, asanas is only a very thin slice of the broad spectrum of yoga. To put it in proper context, if we read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we see there are about 200 sutras, little less than 200 statements or terse aphorisms, out of which only 3 of them talk about the asanas or the physical postures component of it. And so what is the remainder of yoga? What do the other sutras talk about? And as you rightly pointed out, it also deals with practices to do with the mind, inner practices. And it also reveals secrets of the breath and how to harness the power of the breath, and what are the mechanics of the mind, how to bring the mind from a place of a distracted mind to a place of one-pointed mind, and how to silence the mind so that the mind is in a place of tranquility rather than agitation. So the science and the practice of yoga is so rich in the holistic aspect of it. In other words, it's not just dealing with the body, but it gives practices and wisdom that can be applied to bring harmony across all the levels of our existence. So I would say that the practice of asanas is a very good entry point to yoga, because that's where most of the action we see that. For example, when people do breath work or pranayama, uh, you don't see anything visible outside. It is a more subjective experience. Only the practitioner can experience the benefit of it. But if we were to have a spectator watching the yogi practice all these different asanas, pranayama, etc., perhaps they will be more enamored by the action component which happens in the asanas part. So I've noticed that many people, after a few years of asana practice, they are naturally drawn towards what is more in yoga. How can I expand my practice? How can I go deeper? And they're naturally drawn towards the inner practices. And that is exactly how it happened with me as well. So my entry into yoga, I started when I was 11 years old. I started with asanas. And one of my teachers, Srivat Ramaswamy, so he has written a book called Yoga for the Three Stages of Life. There he mentions that it is most appropriate for the yoga practice for youngsters to focus mainly on asanas because they're naturally drawn towards it. And as we progress through life, perhaps the deeper aspects of yoga will resonate with us and we will be naturally drawn towards it as well.
And that makes a lot of sense, Shriramji, because even I'm thinking back from, my own experience and just, from a sort of, beginner's perspective, right? When you go into something like meditation, pranayama, right? There's so many different deeper layers to kind of really refine your practice and really be able to understand and get the full benefits from that practice that, if you were to start like day one with, for example, pranayama or these deep meditative practices, it's not, I feel it's like something where you have to peel back so many layers to truly understand what it is, that starting day one with no background, no foundation, it's going to be very hard to, first of all, be able to, I think, practice in the correct way. And second of all, I feel that it would also be very easy to get, first of all, distracted, but then also get intimidated by the practice just because you have no idea how to practice it. And you may not feel the benefits or what you're being told you need to be felt, when you practice that, specific pranayama practice or meditative practice over time, which is what, generally people who have practiced for years will start feeling. So I think that's, completely right, just empirically speaking. And I think once you start practicing asanas as a first entry point, like you mentioned, that sort of puts you in the flow and more the rhythm of, the proper headspace, the proper mental space, the proper, even physically, just that flow, right? Just how you think about, okay, you want, fluid movements, you want sort of refined movements, no agitation, no kind of deliberate, push and pulls, that kind of a thing. So I think it's definitely a great preparatory practice. And that's also part of the reason why the asana component comes towards the beginning in the whole Ashtanga Yoga philosophy, right? And that's why you have the more meditative aspects and the more sort of more subtle, refined mental aspects of yoga practice towards the end, after you've gotten into your yoga practice, starting with asanas. So yeah, so maybe that's a great way to then segment our way and transition into Ashtanga Yoga. And so, what exactly, Shriramji, is Ashtanga Yoga? I mean, we hear the term, thrown out. You have many different styles of yoga. Ashtanga Yoga is one of these different styles of yoga. But fundamentally, what does Ashtanga Yoga mean, both at a physical practice level as well as more broadly at a conceptual macro level from a yoga philosophy perspective?
In fact, that's a perfect segue, Vedanji. You mentioned that it's very difficult to directly practice meditation without preparing the body. And in fact, that is one of the objectives of Ashtanga Yoga. So Ashtanga, 8 limbs of yoga. That's what it literally means. Ashta means 8, and Anga means limbs. And when we read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he calls them Ashtavangani. Ashtau Angani. That means the 8 limbs of yoga. So why do we talk about the 8 limbs and what roles do they play? Let me give an example. So let's revisit the meditation scenario. If I don't prepare the body, if I directly sit down, close my eyes, and request my mind, oh mind, please be quiet. And most likely it may not listen to us. right? And even if it does listen, maybe it's for a very short period of time, and within few seconds, we keenly become aware of the discomforts in the body, right? So the discomforts in the body, they distract our mind, and the mind doesn't settle down. We become aware of, oh, my lower back hurts, or my knee hurts, or there's an itching sensation on my face. So the body torments our experience unless we first bring the body to a place of stability and comfort, Stiram and Sukham, as Patanjali says. So when we bring the mind to a place of stability and comfort, then we can transcend the body. That means we don't get caught up in the concerns of the body, so that we can deal with the mind directly. We can allow the mind to settle down without being trapped by the confines of the body. So just like how asana helps the practice of meditation, pranayama, for example, that is one of the 8 limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga as well. Pranayama literally means the control of the breath, the control of prana through regulation of the breath. So pranayama, Patanjali says in the Yoga Sutras, it helps to clear the mind of all the mental clog. Prakasha avaranam. Prakasha is the inner clarity. Avaranas is all the clouded thoughts or the confused thoughts that fill the mind, and there is lack of clarity in it. So pranayama allows us to clear this mental clog and reveal the clarity of mind. So when we enter the space of meditation through this lens of clarity, then we experience deep meditation. Otherwise, we get caught up in what is called tamas, which is laziness. The mind is clogged and we are unable to have clarity of mind during meditation. So what this says is, by combining these practices, we make them more powerful. In other words, the practice of meditation is more powerful when we first do asanas and then do pranayama and then do meditation. So this is an example of how bringing together these different segments of yoga practice together, it elevates the quality of the practice. And that is exactly what Ashtanga Yoga does. So each of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, I'm going to enumerate what are the 8 limbs in a few moments. So they fit together so that they enrich the quality of each of these practices. So there is a power that comes from this combination. And this is what is called synergy. By combining together, there is some additional benefit that happens. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, as they say.
Yeah.
So this holistic practice of yoga that combines the practice for the body, practices for the breath, practices for the mind, and also practices of how to engage with the world. That is also part of the Ashtanga Yoga. We will see that in a few moments. So when we put all this together, then each of these 8 limbs of yoga, the quality of that practice gets elevated. We are enhancing the quality of each of these practices. So what are the 8 limbs of
So
the Ashtanga
Shriramji,
Yoga?
just before we go into the 8 limbs, which is going to be a very meaty discussion in and of itself, really quickly, so you mentioned, right, so all the everything is sort of, you can think of these different practices. For example, physical is a preparatory practice for breathing. Breathing practices then help you together with the physical to get in the right headspace for mental practice. So in the yoga practice itself, there's a spectrum between passive practice and then active practice, right? And so, and what I mean by that, just to give some description, is obviously when you're when you're doing meditation, you don't want to be entirely passive and just keep letting thoughts come in and out, have that monkey mind, as they say. But at the same time, on the active side, when you're doing your physical postures, right, you don't want to be too active and be really working up a massive workout program to the point where you feel so tired when you're doing your meditation that it's really falling asleep as opposed to actually meditating. So where in that spectrum of active and passive is the true sort of yoga philosophy and true yoga practice supposed to be? And is it right in the middle, or where exactly on that scale, if you will, do we typically associate true proper yoga practice with?
In fact, they both complement each other. And in fact, in the Yoga Sutras, we see this phrase, prayatna shaitilya. Prayatna shaitilya. Prayatna means effort. In other words, we do. things. There is active participation with the practice. And then the second part, which is the complementary aspect of it, is Shaitya, which is to relax. So they both go hand in hand. And to give an example, for those in the audience who have been to a yoga class, you know that the experience at the end of the yoga class, when we do the final relaxation, Shavasana, or sometimes it's called the Yoga Nidra, the final relaxation part is very blissful, right? There we let go and completely relax the body and mind, and we go into a very beautiful place. The mind enters this place of tranquility. And the reason why we're able to quickly reach that place is initially we're prepared by some active practices. All the asanas, the pranayama that we do, it prepares our mind to relax more. So they both go hand in hand. Now imagine if we did not do the yoga asana practice, if we did not do any body postures, and if we simply lie down the whole time, thinking that, okay, I'm going to go deep in relaxation, it may not happen, right? Because the body may be restless or the mind might wander, it might drift away. So you see the active component of yoga practices and the passive component where we let go and allow ourselves to enter deep relaxation. They both go hand in hand. So prayatna and shaitya, they both go hand in hand. In fact, even the word hatha yoga, ha refers to the sun, which is the active part, and tha refers to the moon, which which symbolizes relaxation. And they both go hand in hand. They complement each other. And one more point that I would like to revisit. It is not that the uh, 8 limbs of yoga are 8 steps. It's not that the asanas lead us towards pranayama and that leads us towards meditation and so forth. All of the 8 limbs simultaneously grow together. So Patanjali does not call it 8 steps of yoga. He doesn't say Ashta Sopana. Sopana means steps. He says Ashta Anga. Angas are limbs. And just like when we consider the limbs of the body, the arms and the legs, it is not that when we were babies, the right arm grows first fully, and then the left arm grows, and then the legs grow. So it's a simultaneous growth of all the limbs. So the point is, yes, asanas does help with meditation, deeper quality of meditation, and the vice versa is also true. The more deep we go in meditation, it helps us in our asana practice as well. So let me narrate a small story that happened when I was studying with my teacher, Subramanian Ramaswamy. So I studied with him for 14 years. So one day, one of my co-students, he was attempting advanced yoga posture, and he was trying very hard for several days, and he was unable to reach that final posture. So he asked my teacher, how do I increase my flexibility? I really want to bring the feet to my head. I'm unable to expand the comfort zone and become more flexible. And so we were all eager to find out what the teacher is going to say. So we thought he's going to say, oh, do this practice, that practice, do this advanced posture, it'll lead you to the final step. But we were surprised by the answer he gave. He said, meditate more every day. Because when we bring the mind to a place of silence and tranquility, when the mind is relaxed, the body also relaxes. And the muscles relax. And from a relaxed state, the body becomes more light. Angalaghavam, it is called in Sanskrit. The body becomes more agile, more light, more limber. So the flexibility arises as a consequence of quieting the mind. So you see how meditation also helps in the practice of asana. So they all go hand in hand, and they have a simultaneous blossoming, simultaneous growth in yoga.
And I think that's a very subtle point, which even I would say I myself didn't pick up at first, because, you know, even if we look at the sequence of the class, right, how it progresses, we start with the very active, then we go into a set of asanas, which is more of a flowing component. Then from there we do our relaxation, and then from there meditation and breathing. And so this makes a lot of sense because, like you said, right, just on the mat, right, when for example, you're holding a final position, right, if you're, if you don't have that meditative component to it, when you're holding a final position, what you're going to be thinking is, oh, my arm is hurting, my side is hurting, like it's going to be very tough, right? And you agonize the countdown, right, to hold that particular final asana. But if you truly are able to get into that meditative state in combination with holding that final position, right, then it should become like a very natural thing. And it's like a sort of, it's another form of meditation per se, except while doing the actual physical posture and holding it out there, right? And then vice versa, where you, like you said, right, you can't go into meditation directly because you're a little bit, you need to sort of open the body, expand the body, have the body, be in the right physical preparation in order to enter that meditative state. So I think that's a very subtle point, which I didn't fully appreciate before. So that's a very, thank you for crystallizing that a little bit clearer. So with that, I think, we've danced around the topic of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. So what exactly are the 8 limbs?
So let us quickly go through the 8 limbs. I will enumerate them. And of course, in the future sessions, we will zoom in and we will explore in depth. So the 8 limbs of yoga start with Yama. The first limb is called Yama, which literally means control. The literal meaning of Yama is control. And it talks about how we control ourselves when we deal with the world. And there are 5 tenets that are covered in the practice of Yama. We will explore that later. But an example of that would be non-violence. So when we interact with the world, we come from a place of non-violence. That is an example of practicing Yama. The second limb is called Niyama. Niyama literally means to regulate or to discipline. And some of the niyamas that are listed in the Yoga Sutras include cleanliness, for example, to keep the surroundings clean, to keep the body clean, etc. So cleanliness, shaucha, it is called. So like that, there are some practices associated with niyama. And the point is that in order to make progress in the path of yoga, it helps to create that space. For example, when the surroundings are cluttered, perhaps it reflects in the mind as well. And when the surroundings are clean, it becomes easier to bring clarity of mind as well. So that is the second limb of yoga, which is the niyamas. The third limb is asanas. And as you pointed out, that is the most visible part of yoga, where people are focused on the asana aspect, especially in the yoga mat, where majority of the practice is asanas. And asanas literally means seat, to position the body or seat the body in a place where we can forget the body or transcend the body and enter the place of meditation. So of course, there is a variety of asanas, and to keep the body fit and agile and light. So we will talk about more on asanas in one of the future sessions. And the fourth limb of Ashtanga Yoga is pranayama. Pranayama, which literally means lengthening the prana or to draw more energy through the prana. So regulating the energy that flows in this system. We can think of it as the control of the physiological processes that happen in the body, to regulate them so that it is not haphazard or restless, but there is a harmonious flow of the prana or the energy that courses through the body. So that is pranayama. And here we harness the power of the breath to bring the rhythm to the prana, the flow of prana. And then the fifth limb of Ashtanga Yoga is called pratyahara, which means the control over what we let in through our senses. So the word ahara means food. And in the context of yoga, it is not just the food that we consume for nutrition, like what we eat. Ahara also means whatever we consume through our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, smell, or touch. So whatever we receive through our senses is also ahara. So prati ahara or pratyahara, which is the fifth limb of yoga, is concerns itself with how we regulate what we consume through our senses. Just like we want to be careful that we eat nutritious food, not junk food. So like that, are we careful to let in things through our senses that uplift us, that bring harmony to us? That is pratyahara. The last three limbs, namely dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, are called inner practices or antaranga yoga. So dharana is the practice of focusing the mind, bringing the mind towards one pointedness, collecting the mind together so it's not scattered, it is focused. So the practice associated with focusing the mind is dharana. And then dhyana is meditation, the seventh limb of Ashtanga Yoga. And dhyana concerns itself with bringing the mind to a place of tranquility, silencing the mental chatter. And we will explore more deeper into it when we examine the exact statement that Patanjali makes in the Yoga Sutras, the sutra where he defines what is meditation or dhyana. We will cover that in one of the future sessions. But briefly, it is a practice to quiet the mind so that the mind abides in a place of silence and tranquility. And then the last practice of Ashtanga Yoga, the eighth limb, is Samadhi. The literal meaning of Samadhi is equanimous state of the mind. Sama means equal, Dhi refers to the intellect. So Samadhi literally means a place of mental equipoise or equilibrium. So rather than the mind going through the ups and downs, getting agitated sometimes in ecstasy or depressed sometimes, going through these ups and downs, when we bring the mind to a place of centeredness, so that we go through life from a place of equipoise rather than getting perturbed. So this practice is samadhi. So these are the eight limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And then the true Ashtanga Yoga culminates in what is called Samyama. Samyama is the combination of the last three angas of Ashtanga Yoga, namely Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi, which is called Samyama. And what does it mean? We will explore again this in one of the future sessions. So we could say that Ashtanga Yoga, the eight limbs begin with the Yama, Niyama, and all the way to Samyama. So that is the journey of Ashtanga Yoga.
Yeah, thanks for, beautifully laying that out. And I think there's a lot to unpack under each of the different limbs, right? So it's very hard to do justice. I mean, even here, we've only scratched the surface, right, for these different limbs and what exactly the implications are and what the, what can we actually learn from it and take away from it, which is why we want to dedicate a couple sessions going forward to these various different limbs of Ashtanga Yoga to actually understand and unpack much more about what each one actually means and how do we actually think about applying each one of those into, daily life and so forth. But I think one of the key points, right, that you mentioned is that throughout the progression of, Ashtanga Yoga, if you take all the limbs in totality, that is sort of a framework for acting and decisions both on and off the mat, right? So like you mentioned, the most visible aspect of Ashtanga Yoga is probably the asana practice. And then to a certain extent, the meditative section, the pranayama, the breathing practice, that's sort of a discrete, practice that you will do at, whatever time of the day, something that fits within your schedule. And so that those are discrete practices that you actively think about and you probably most typically associate with, yoga and the actual practice of yoga, right? But other things like, for example, the yama and the niyamas, and so general principles like cleanliness, right? Being, being clean, but also telling the truth, things like that, right? So those, sort of more moral and just sort of more, I guess, less tangible aspects of yoga practice are also as powerful, if not more powerful than your asana practice itself, right? And so I think that's very interesting to sort of understand the notion that Ashtanga Yoga is kind of a framework for living life more broadly. And so it applies very significantly both off the mat as well as it does on the mat, right? So I think that's something that, for people who are new or just getting introduced to yoga, that's something that's very important to keep in mind. And I think a very key subtle point that a lot of people, I think, just when you are introduced directly to yoga, you don't even think about that, because that can tend to have maybe, let's just say, religious connotations, or that can tend to have more sort of moral connotations with it. But really, it all fits under this one umbrella of Ashtanga Yoga. And so it's important to, I think, keep all those different topics and concepts in mind. And just taking it back a full circle to what we said at the beginning, right, where really the parts, together you can practice them discreetly, but it's really the sum altogether that is going to be arguably greater than the value you get from each of these individual parts. Because when you put all of these different practices and these different, discrete aspects of the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy together, and actually apply that on a day-to-day basis in your daily life, you'll be able to, I think, take your sense of living right to just the whole next level, because you'll be able to put all these different topics together. You'll be able to understand how the interconnectedness of each of these together really, flows out. And I think, from that point of view, it's incredibly important to be able to understand that this is, sort of a fluid system where you have a lot of moving parts, but if you can get the pieces to come together, then it really is a powerful combination that you can't find elsewhere. So I think that's an interesting point, and arguably the core focus that Patanjali probably puts forth in these 8 limbs, and why he's even put forth 8 limbs and not just 3 limbs like the asana, the pranayama, the breathing, for example. So that's a very interesting point, and I think our audience would definitely would really, I think, benefit from understanding that subtlety there. So thank you for bringing that up. So
to
I think
add to that,
yeah, please do.
so in fact, Patanjali himself, when he talks about these different angas, these limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, he gives the definition of what that practice is, as well as the core benefit of it. For example, what is the benefit of asanas? What is the benefit of abiding by the rules of yama, niyama? And what are the benefits of pranayama? Like that, he gives specific benefits for each of the 8 limbs. And then, interestingly, he also gives the benefit that comes by combining these practices. So as you rightly pointed out, one of the unique aspects of this holistic practice is the combination gives something extra special. So what additional benefit does the combination give that also is articulated by Patanjali? And it's very interesting. That's where the synergy comes. The power of this combination shines through in this practice of Ashtanga Yoga. My teacher used to say that this combination of practices is extraordinarily powerful. The yama, niyama, the asanas, etc. When we combine all these 8, it is extraordinarily powerful. And when we invite this combination in our lives every day, when we diligently practice these 8 limbs of yoga, we create the platform for enormous personal growth to happen. And it also creates the platform for well-being to blossom in our lives. So both a well-being as well as extraordinary growth that comes about. And that's the power of this combination.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's very true. And to a certain extent, right, these are also, it's very hard to make these different 8 limbs, if you will, sort of discrete entities that can kind of be practiced independently, right? So what I mean by that is, if you were to do, for example, the asana component, after a while, you'll start doing asanas, you'll get better at it. And then as you're holding the final practice, you'll start understanding a little bit more and starting to reflect on that meditative state there. But then from there, that'll then, lead you to maybe want to do proper meditation, whether it's, just sitting for a couple of minutes a day, just kind of reflecting, contemplating, right? And once you're doing that asana and meditative component, if you're going that far, then it's, then it seems very hard to be able to do that and then go and say, let's just say, live your life that's in direct opposition to the yamas and the niyamas, right? So if you're meditating and doing your yoga practice, but let's just say you're not showering every day, or you're living in a very, disgusting environment, that just seems extremely contradictory. And so it seems very hard to me to perceive that you can kind of have one component or 1 or 2 components, but not have the rest, right? So to a certain extent, all these things kind of come together. And I think once you first of all, I think recognize that, this is what Ashtanga Yoga is, and here are the different components and building blocks. I think once you start in the journey towards one, it's very hard to sort of silo yourself into just that one component, because once you do get introduced to that one component, you then start to understand, okay, these are all the other components. That maybe component is not even the right word, but here are all the other sort of aspects of it that, you need to take into account. And all of those things together then come together under your yoga practice. And so once you, I think, start, it's very hard if you are a sort of normal person and just normal individual who lives by these philosophies. It's very hard to not encompass all of them, although it will take time to reach the ultimate states that some of these things, like for example Samadhi, actually entail. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to work towards just one out of 8, for example, as opposed to working towards the entire Ashtanga Yoga philosophy as a whole. So that's just something that I think, thinking about this, it seems to make a lot more sense. And I can understand why we don't, necessarily say that, okay, one step is not the progression to the next, and this is the ultimate state of being. And so these are sort of interconnected parts that together form a whole, and you can't kind of try to isolate one and just, focus on that per se without having the others.
In fact, my teacher used to give an example. If you want to keep this little pinky finger healthy, then it really requires the whole body to be healthy. You want a healthy heart so that it can pump the blood supply, it circulates brisk in the system, so it reaches all the cells of this little pinky finger. You want the kidneys to function well. You want, in fact, the whole body should function in its peak form for any little part of the body to experience exuberant health. So ultimately, it's the holistic health that benefits the entire system.
Yes, exactly. And I think, that's why we talk about this whole integrated systematic approach to yoga practice, right? Because, it's very hard. There are so many different micro steps here that even if you, maybe, even if you don't necessarily perceive it directly, like, for example, if you just go into asana practice, you are subconsciously, doing breathing, you are subconsciously meditating the final position. So whether you intentionally or unintentionally try to embrace or avoid those other aspects, by nature of doing one, you kind of are getting the full package, although it takes time to refine the later steps, because those are the more subtle, intangible aspects of the practice, which I think you just get with time. So that's a very interesting point. And I think that's something that, I myself also didn't appreciate that much before, but now just thinking about it and contemplating about it a little bit more, it makes sense that, okay, we've subconsciously been doing this, even if we didn't directly recognize it. So I think that's a very interesting framework to kind of think about when, myself, the audience, goes into yoga practice next. And so that's something that I think we definitely will, keep in mind going forward. So, on the topic, Shriramji, of Ashtanga Yoga, so this is 8 limbs, but I've heard before that there are 6 limbs or 7-limbed approaches to yoga. So why is there this variation? And ultimately, at the end of the day, are they sort of different manifestations of the same concepts that are being put forth by Patanjali in the in Ashtanga Yoga, or what is the key sort of, I guess, similarities and differences, if you will, between these different sort of limbed approaches of yoga?
You're right. The core essence is the same, and different yoga texts, uh, they give a little shade of difference between the exact enumeration of the limbs of yoga. Most famous, of course, is the Ashtanga Yoga, and many scriptures of yoga talk about the 8 limbs. There are other ways to spin this multi-limbed yoga, if you will. So there is a system called Ashtanga Yoga that is mentioned in some of the Hatha Yoga texts, such as, for example, the teachings of Gorakshanath. So he enumerates the 6-limbed steps of yoga, which is basically a subset of the Ashtanga Yoga. And he assumes that Yama and Niyama is already well established. So he deals only from asanas to samadhi. So those 6 limbs he highlights as the Shadanga Yoga. There's also a Saptanga Yoga approach, which is a 7-limbed yoga that we find, for example, in the Gheranda Samhita, another classic Hatha Yoga text, which includes some of the other angas which are not present in the Ashtanga Yoga. For example, it includes the Shat Karmas, which is, for example, the Kapalabhati and the Kriya practices. So that becomes one Anga. And also another Anga is the Mudras. So like that, different enumeration that comes together as the seven-limbed yoga is presented in that specific text, Geranda Samhita. Like that, we see some variations. But of course, the most popular or the most widely read and practiced is the Ashtanga Yoga.
Definitely. And I would expect, yeah, that the major concepts, the core themes and the essence would be the same, but I guess, different people have interpreted it differently. So it's interesting. And I guess you could make the same argument with the different, styles of yoga. I know we were having this discussion a couple of weeks ago, but at the end of the day, I think it's, it's the same sort of key features and key principles, if you will, that are being emphasized. It's, maybe in certain styles of yoga, you dial up one aspect more than the other, but at the end of the day, that core foundation is still a commonality. And it's something that I think all these different styles of yoga, right, together emphasize, although in different proportions for each one. So that's very interesting. So I think, before we wrap up, probably just relating this a little bit more, we've already touched upon a lot of how we can, bring the aspect of Ashtanga Yoga into our daily lives. And we'll have a lot more to say on this in the next couple of podcasts as well, where we delve into the depths of, for example, the different yamas and niyamas and what do they mean and how can we actually, apply that to our daily lives. But at a more macro level, Shriramji, what guidance or advice would you have for our audience and our listeners who are maybe new to yoga? They've had the physical component where they attend a weekly class or they practice yoga by themselves on a regular basis. But now that we've talked about Ashtanga Yoga, and now that it's so much more than just the physical postures and the physical benefits, and even just meditation and pranayama, what guidance would you have for our listeners who want to maybe bring these different components of Ashtanga Yoga into their daily lives at a very high level, knowing that we'll touch upon this in a couple sessions in the future? What general guidance, tips would you have as our audience starts to think about incorporating this into their daily practice?
In fact, one thing that can powerfully elevate the quality of the yoga practice is to slowly start bringing the other limbs of yoga as well. Not just shine the spotlight on asanas, but also introduce pranayama, meditation, and even the principles of yama, niyama, etc. And we will notice that we graduate our practice to the next level. Many people think that if I need to progress in the path of yoga, I need to do more and more advanced postures. But that's not true at all. My teacher used to give this example of if you want to make progress in the mathematics, it is not that you will add and multiply bigger and bigger numbers. That's calculator can do that much more efficiently than the human mind. But for example, when we progress in mathematics, perhaps we graduate to doing trigonometry or calculus and so forth. Like that, to make progress in the path of yoga, it is not more and more complex postures that will get us along the way, but to integrate all the different elements of this yoga practice. So introducing all the 8 limbs of yoga. And as you also pointed out, all these can be implemented not just inside the yoga mat, but also in our day-to-day life outside the yoga mat as well. For example, we can practice ahimsa, the non-violence, being kind to everyone, both inside and outside the yoga mat, being kind to our own body so that we don't torture the body by going outside of our comfort zone when we do asanas. That's how we can practice ahimsa inside the yoga mat. And when we deal with the outside world, practicing ahimsa there as well. And even while sitting in front of a computer, we can sit with a posture that is steady and comfortable, Sthiram and Sukham. That is another way in which we can apply the principles of asanas, not just inside the yoga mat, but throughout the course of the day. And we will discover that when we keep the posture steady and comfortable, we are able to bring the mind to a place of alertness as well. Because the posture of the body and the state of the mind, they go hand in hand. So if we see somebody slouched and most likely perhaps they're feeling drowsy or they're already half asleep, So the body posture reflects the state of the mind as well. And so we can apply these principles both inside and outside the yoga mat.
Yeah, now I'm starting to sit up myself to make sure that I don't start going down that path. But no, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think, we have the high level picture now. You're right, having had this conversation of Ashtanga Yoga and just broadly, what are the 8 different, I have to choose my words carefully now because of what we talked about, how they're interrelated parts and no longer, my previous thinking was that they were sort of a stepping stone building block, right, for one to the others. So I have to choose my words carefully now, but now we have, the sort of framework for Ashtanga Yoga, the different parts and how they're sort of interconnected and what exactly those different building blocks are. And so I think in the next couple of podcasts, we'll have a chance to delve deeper into each of these 8 different limbs and sort of more tangibly understand what exactly do, for example, each of the yamas mean, what do each of the niyamas mean? And, some of them are basic, but some of them are not so basic. And so how can we actually more tangibly, think about applying that to our daily lives? So I think that in the next couple of sessions, we'll hopefully give our audience a little bit more crystallization about how to think through each of these different sort of limbs and where they can apply this to their daily lives and both practice on and off the yoga mat. So I think that's it for today. And hopefully, to our audience members, hopefully you were able to get a little sense of what we're trying to do in these different podcasts, and hopefully you found it informative. We had a brief discussion on Ashtanga Yoga today. Of course, we're only scratching the surface. There's a lot more to unpack in this topic, which is why we're going to be devoting a couple more sessions to actually exploring the different limbs under Ashtanga Yoga. But as always, if you do have any kind of questions, comments, any topics you'd like us to discuss on this podcast, feel free to reach out at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know with any thoughts you have. And as we just pilot this initiative, we'd love any feedback, input that you might have. And so anything and everything is always helpful and appreciated. So with that, before we close, I'll turn it over to you, Shriramji, if you have any final closing thoughts.
Thank you, Vedantji, and thanks for listening. For those of us who tuned into this podcast, and we look forward to the future unfolding of this series.
So thank you all. With that, namaste, and we will see you again soon with the next version of the podcast, and we will let you know once it has been released.
Namaste.
Namaste.